Thank you, Elise. I hope you can all hear me. It was a great introduction, and as Elise said, AI is currently a very hot topic and has been for the past few years. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I feel that still there are many institutions that have not really looked into or delved into utilizing various forms of AI technologies for their business, be it NLP, machine learning, robot process automation, or neural networks, or any other form of AI that could add great efficiencies. Others have looked into implementing various AI technologies, however, have encountered a variety of problems in the implementation process and the project plan. So the basis of today's discussion with our esteemed panelists is to delve into some of the challenges, opportunities, and best practices around implementing AI technologies in business. So Ralph, Maxine, Ron, welcome to you all. Thank you for being here with us today. My first question, if I may, I'll shoot off to Ron. What are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen making in terms of AI, ML type project implementations?
Thanks, Nazir. First of all, thanks for having me on the panel. And as someone passionate about innovation in general and AI in particular, I'm very happy to share some of my personal opinions and also the vision of Microsoft in this topic. Some of the biggest mistakes, I think, what we see is two common approaches that we rarely see working, and they are both the complete opposite of each other. On one hand, what doesn't work is if you're going to zero in on one very small use case that is not part of a wider strategy. And as AI projects, they can fail due to lack of data, lack of good predictions, etc. You risk not having a result. It's also very expensive, and it's not replicable, even if it's a success. On the other hand, what also doesn't work is if you start an enormous program, you will spend tons of resources and time in collecting and storing data across the company before actually doing any kind of AI. Your stakeholders, your sponsors, they might lose interest in what you're doing, and you're spending a lot of work, a lot of money without any concrete results. So, as always, pragmatism works here. You unite above strategies, which means you embark on a platform approach with a couple of AI use cases that you're actually going to implement. And if you combine it with an agile development methodology, where you kind of iterate quickly and kind of adapt and tweak based on the results that you get, and get new sources on board, get new use cases into the equation, I think you're on a more successful strategy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ron. Just a quick note to the audience that are watching, please do take time to post any questions in the chat as part of the session, and I'll try and bring those into the discussion as we go along. Let me turn to Maxine. Maxine, hi, how are you? Oh, I think you're on mute. We couldn't hear you there.
Oh, no, still on mute.
We can't hear you, Maxine.
There you go.
Is that better? There we go. Excellent.
Apologies for that.
Well, no problem at all. Welcome, Maxine.
Thank you.
From your perspective, I mean, what are some of the technical risks specifically that you've seen or encountered in terms of project implementations that maybe are underestimated or not factored in by institutions around AI projects?
Well, so they're more than one, as you can guess, so I'll have to summarize quite a lot. So they're mainly related to the tactical debt or the technical footprint. And what I mean by that is one of the most obvious, but it's still there today, unfortunately, is the mismatch between the environment. So to make it short, let's assume that you have two types of environments. You have on one side the sandbox. So this is where you implement the model, you test, validate, blah, blah, blah. So that goes from dev, UAT, pre-prod. And then you have the operations, which is the production. Now, as you know, AI ML requires a lot of resources, software like libraries, for instance, and hardware like GPUs. And what happens quite often is that the people who are maintaining the sandbox environment don't necessarily talk to the people who are maintaining the operation. Or if they do so, what happens is that what is required in operation has to be validated by the operation, and that takes time. And so sometimes it doesn't happen. So you have the concept of throwing over the fence that happened in that case. So that's the first challenge. And then the second one is what I call the shopping basket trauma. So this is where on one side you have so many underlying technologies to AI and ML, and on the other side you have data scientists that are keen to evaluate all of them, of course. And as you can guess, this becomes very, very quickly a chaos, which is impossible to maintain. So these are the very two obvious risks that you might have.
No, thank you for that, Maxine. Ralph, bringing you into this discussion, welcome. I hope you're feeling good today.
All fine here.
Excellent. What I wanted to know from you, what do you feel that organizations sometimes don't fully appreciate or understand the scope and the limits of AI ML when they're going about the project planning and implementation process?
Well, it kind of depends on how you tackle the problem. So relating to what Ron and Maxime said before, sometimes you have people who think they have understood how AI works, but they underestimate how you can implement it. For example, they're the dogma of fail fast, which actually does not mean you're bound for failure, but it's more or less fail cheap and fail as soon as possible is one thing. And I've seen different implementations. I've worked for a large airline, I've worked for a telco, I've worked for a large pharmaceutical, and there were different approaches to the whole thing. So, for example, one company said, okay, fine, we'll do AI. That's a given, and we'll invest 1 million, and now we'll embrace AI. And they basically ran into the same trap that Ron was mentioning. They set up a huge warehouse, but they had no idea what they wanted to do with the whole thing. On the other side, you also have companies who think they have understood AI and then run into the trap, one of the traps that Maxime was mentioning. They basically don't understand that there is a huge difference in implementing something on the laptop of a bunch of smart students compared to getting this up to an operational level when you're, for example, an insurance company. If you run a churn model on a laptop, yeah, see, it works, AI is working. Oh, great. And then everybody's getting excited. And then they don't realize that they need to do proper data warehousing, that they need to set up an operational system to really get it going. So that's on the issues that we see, or that we have seen, or I've seen in projects on the operational side. And then, of course, you have people who think AI can solve everything. You know, it's like the panacea of everything. Typically, these are the things where you enter a board meeting and somebody's presenting something, and then somebody poses the question, "Hey, can't you just AI it?" No, you can't just AI it. You know, you need to have a proper use case. You need to evaluate: do you have the data at hand? Does it really make sense? So I think the biggest issue is you always have to start with a good use case. You have to have some knowledge about AI. You know, you don't have to be able to build a car, or you don't have to be a mechanic to drive a car. But even in driver's education, you get a minimum understanding of how does a car behave, and what's a clutch for, and what happens when you're getting on ice with your car.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, Ralph, maybe to summarize a little bit as well, it sounds like AI projects suffer sometimes from the general project implementation or solution implementation problems, that people haven't fully understood the problem that they are trying to solve and looked for the right solution. Do you see that a lot with AI? People just say, we need an AI and let's go and do it, without actually fully understanding whether the AI is appropriate.
Yeah, there's a huge difference in implementing AI for your company and, for example, changing your CRM system or updating or going from one system to an SAP implementation. For that, you surely need a proper plan. You need to get all the budget sorted out, and you have a long-term plan. But the difference is, you know, it will work because it works for other companies. If you get started with AI, it might work or it might not work. So the better plan is to do this in a very agile and incremental way. and I've seen that, for example, the pharmaceutical I've been working for, they didn't go and say, hey, here is 5 million, let's go and AI our complete company. They basically started with a small team that the data scientists, project managers, some people doing the data lineage, and they toured the complete company in a, how can I say that, we help you cooking your meal sort of way. So they toured the company, went from department, do you have some data? Do you have a problem? We'll help you. It'll be free of charge. You only have to contribute with the data and the results that we achieve, and share that with the rest of the company. And that was actually a very, very successful way of running the AI project.
Okay. Ron, the great example there from Ralph, but from your broad experience at Microsoft, what other types of projects have you seen where people have looked to use AI and it's not really been fit for purpose? I mean, what projects, maybe it's better to look at it this way, what projects are not really suited to an AI type solution?
Yeah, and I think the word AI is already a funny start, because if you ask 10 people what is AI, you get 10 different definitions. And machine learning is just one of the technologies you can use for doing AI. And basically, when you start a project, you need to ask yourself, will my solution benefit from self-learning technology? Will it need to detect patterns? Will it need to learn from large quantities of data? Will it need to do thousands of simulations? And if your question is yes on any of these, well, AI might help you. Not necessarily, but it might help you. And many problems, they don't necessarily need AI or machine learning. However, they could really delight your users. And I take a very, very simple example. We all have windscreen wipers on our cars. Some of those are automated. When it starts to rain, they start wiping your windscreen. Well, the ones in my car, they have a self-learning model behind it. Every time I operate them manually, they kind of retrain themselves to better respond to how I want my windscreen to be wiped. This is something that doesn't need AI at all, but it really delights the user and it really helps them have a more enjoyable experience, not having any kind of problems anymore with the dry windscreen.
Yeah. I mean, Maxime, I mean, from my personal experience working in the finance industry, but I'm sure it's similar in other industries and large organizations. Over the years, firms have developed various sort of, hodgepodge infrastructure with sort of distinct and almost fragmented data sources. How important do you see a robust data framework being to the success of an AI project?
Well, there is a famous quote that I absolutely love, which says that today the world is made of energy, matter, and data. And for me, that is probably the shortest and the best answer to your question. So it's obviously the most important part, yeah. I think, as Ralph said earlier, there are so many organizations that neglect the fact that data are crucial and the data understanding is crucial. So now, to have the right data, you need the right platform, and preferably robust, of course. And on top of that platform, what is important is to have a set of commodities, like recipes, for instance, that a monitoring and alert mechanism which is able to detect that there is a shift in your data, for instance. So you can detect immediately that shift, and therefore you can adjust the model, or at least you can react quicker. So this is crucial. This concept of commodities is crucial, and this is what is offered by various platforms. Azure is of course one of the platform. There are many others, and the set of commodities is the key.
Yeah. Ralph, I mean, and actually all three of you, if I may ask for your opinions on this, but let's start with Ralph. I mean, everyone at some point was new to AI, new to project implementation, new to the solution architectures around AI. From your own experience, maybe you could share with us some of the key lessons you've learned that still hold dear to you and are absolutely critical in sort of an AI project implementation plan.
I think the true AI part, so that'll be the part that, for example, somebody like Maxime would execute on an Azure platform, is actually I don't want to say the easiest, but the smallest part in comparison with cleaning up the stuff and preparing everything and aligning everything, making sure you have a data lineage, because the fragmentation of the data sources and getting that through the mills of a company and preparing that you have some clean data to work on is probably the harder part. It's kind of like building a nuclear bomb. So you need a specialist to assemble the whole thing, but we all know that it takes a long time to get the necessary material in a decent amount to really get things started.
Okay, and Ron, what about you? What sort of key lessons have you learned through your experiences?
I think there are two things that I would like to share. I think one is that an AI project is never finished. Once it is in production, circumstances might change, making your predictions less accurate. And these can be small things like changing a sensor on a production line that is differently calibrated, or more kind of bigger things like the COVID pandemic that really changed customer behavior dramatically last year. I'm pretty sure there are many algorithms that were not up for that. And so you need to constantly watch out for retraining and reconfiguring of your AI project, and you need to set budget aside for that. You cannot say, well, it's in production, it's done now. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention here is openness and collaboration. We've seen great things happen when companies don't kind of do things on their own and in a kind of a black box thing, but when they start to share. I think a very great example, also related to the COVID pandemic, is something that we did with UCB, the pharma company based in Brussels. They were participating in a worldwide effort to kind of better understand the COVID virus or the coronavirus. And they volunteered to offer some of their proprietary algorithms to kind of decipher the genome of the virus. Complicated tasks, and using their patented algorithms, using their existing hardware infrastructure, it would have taken them 6 months or more to do this. Now then they said, well, maybe we can use cloud technology. They turned to Microsoft. We helped them out with an AI for Health grant. We gave them a lot of compute power in the cloud. And within 3 days, they could do that same effort that normally would take 6 months. And frankly, they helped not only themselves, not only this kind of effort, but basically the whole world in better understanding the virus and accelerating the creation of vaccines. And I think that's an extraordinary example of this openness and transparency around the AI that you do.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Ron, in a second after this. I've heard from Maxime around talking a bit about this collaboration and people element. But Maxime, what are some of the key things you've learned through your time working on AI projects?
So devils is in the detail, and governance is one of the key aspects from my perspective. So there are loads of questions that people today, so data scientists and data managers should ask themselves, like, for instance, do we version all models? So quite often they version control the source code, but do they version the model? And if the question is why, is logically you should version the model with the data set you've used, so whether it's the training or the testing data set, for instance. And why do you have to do all of that? Because at some stage, one day you will have to justify yourself, whether it's to the auditor, like particularly in financial services, but also to the colleagues, or if we talk about ethical later, that's also something that you have to do to the community, is to provide a certain level of explanation on what you've done and how you did it. And that can be done through governance.
Okay, you brought up a key word there, ethics, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But just a quick follow-on with you, Maxime. Do you feel maybe, I mean, we live in an environment today where people want things done yesterday, right? And I've seen over time that, you know, the amount of sort of resource and time spent on a sort of QA process tends to, there's a lot of pressure to reduce the time spent on that and implement as soon as possible. With AI projects, the back testing and iteration loop is quite critical to ensuring that you get the right results. Do you feel that sometimes firms don't fully appreciate the necessity to go through a rigorous process of back testing and iteration?
Well, unfortunately, I do, yes. And that's why, if I refer to what I was saying earlier about these commodities, you have the platform Azure, for instance, is giving you all these tools that facilitate that. So quite often, and this is where the frustration is, not only from my side as an advisor or consultant, but also from the organization perspective, is they feel that frustration once they realize that all these tools are there to help. They either didn't know or they didn't have the time to use them. And the funny bit is, I'm not sure it's funny, but the interesting bit is that as soon as they realize the time they've lost trying to put something in place and compare that to the time they would have consumed by learning the tool, then they would clearly have a benefit.
Yeah. It's still a huge problem, isn't it? Business people want things now, and they don't fully appreciate the efforts required, right? But maybe turning to the business side with you both, Ralph and Ron. People are obviously critical to the process of any project, be it in terms of the implementation, the project plan, bringing in the resources, but also those on the business side that may be impacted or be users eventually of the technology that's put in. There is a lot of fear mongering still around AI. What are some of the issues that you've encountered on the people side? Both from the user and broader business perspective, but also in terms of the teams that are assigned, skill sets available, etc., to the projects. Maybe we'll start with you, Ralph.
I think you have to differentiate in between business and people's issues. So from the business side, I think the legal aspects are always prevailing. So we have seen that. We have been in discussions. For example, you do something on AI that recognizes incoming documents for, let's say, for an insurance company. So let's say a smart mail inbox that already suggests the next best action, or for example, same thing with anti-money laundering, or the same thing with visual AI. It's always legal kicking in. So the fight with legal and with the organization itself is always like, oh, can we do this? So the GDPR hammer is quite a big, let's say, I don't want to say showstopper, but it slows down the process. So people, there are good use cases, but then legal gets involved, says, I don't understand, why do we have to do that? Oh, we are sharing data with an external company. No, we can't do that. And then suddenly people decide, I don't want to go through all these loops and hoops. I'd rather kill the project, and we keep on doing what we're doing. That's one side. On the people side, of course, there's a lot of skepticism around, can an algorithm be better than a human being? We see Tesla accidents, we see stuff going wrong, we see bias. But actually, the bias is something that people want in there. We're training an algorithm. Right? That's the whole point to it. We're training an algorithm to behave like a human being, and the human is always biased. It's just you have to understand to what level. So the people fears. It's a little bit like if you rewind the clock 110 years ago. Nobody would argue that cars are something that should be immediately forbidden. But if you turn the clock 120 or 110 years ago, it was a huge threat to people's business. All the cart people, the horse breeders, and everything. Same thing there. And if you take a look at the Red Flag Act in the UK, they actually tried to prevent that, but in the end, you cannot really stop that from happening.
Yeah. And yourself, Ron, I mean, have you dealt from a broader, I'm sure you've been involved in a multitude of different projects around this, but where you've seen maybe resistance, or what I'd be interested to hear from you as well is, the skill sets available. I mean, it's still a relatively specialist sort of arena dealing with AI, both on the mathematical side and maybe on the technology side. What are some of the issues you've encountered?
Yeah, and I'll come back on the skilling in a second. But what I wanted to share is like one of our first experiences with AI, where we worked with a very large mining company, and we developed together with a partner in Luxembourg. We developed an algorithm or a model that could create more yield for the company. And they had a better return. They had more of the product coming out at the end of the process. It worked fine in testing. It went into production, and then it turned out that the operator that would get that information on the screen, he just neglected it because of, well, I have 20, 30 years of experience operating this production line, and now your algorithm is coming to tell me that I should do something that is counterintuitive to my nature. I'm not going to do that. And they basically ignored it, and the project failed. And I think a key lesson learned there is, don't see it as an IT problem that you fix. Make sure that these operators, those process owners, etc., are involved from the very first second, so they are co-owner of the product, and it's not something that is being pushed by IT to them. I think that was a huge eye-opener for me and for everybody involved in the project, where you have something great, but due to the way you have implemented it and presented it to the actual user, it failed nonetheless. And maybe just coming back on the skilling part, I think what had happened, and I think we are maybe all a little bit guilty on that, is when we saw the advent of AI and machine learning, I think a lot of people started to label themselves, instead of data engineer, they start to label themselves data scientist. And obviously, I understand it, and maybe I was a part guilty of that as well. On the other hand, it's not because you're interested in AI and you like to do it that you're already an expert in that, right? So working with a partner, working with people, you really need to understand what is your core specialty. Are you a data engineer that can make sure I have the right data and the right format to do AI? Or are you a data scientist that can take the data and then build a predictive model based upon that?
Yeah, this I find it's been quite a big problem, actually, because as we discussed in our preliminary meetings, I myself, I used to do machine learning in the front office in capital markets as an algo trader. And what I've seen over the past 3-4 years, particularly in the area of fintech, financial technology, is every platform and their mother naming themselves an AI platform. And when you dig a little deeper, the reality, and as you say, people calling themselves data scientists, data engineers, and you have to rely on this this branding that they create for themselves. But in most cases, they're doing nothing more than just statistics, And I mean, there is a kind of jump and a fine line between, the higher degrees of statistics and truly self-learning models in AI. But, because it became so trendy, everyone seemed to want to put this brand around themselves, right? I mean, have you encountered problems with that? I mean, I'd like to hear from all of you where, the claims of a person or a skill set or a technology have gone are not quite living up to the expectations. Maybe Maxime, I'm sure, I mean, with your specialism as well, you must encounter a lot of people who maybe overboast about what they're able to do.
Yeah, most likely, and I'll be well. I will build on what Ron was saying. I think we all guilty, and myself included. We tend to believe that even if we have a decent amount of experience in machine learning, we tend to believe that we know everything. But today the tech landscape, it's so vast that you can't cover. Yeah, I mean, even if we are clever animals, I would say, we can't encompass absolutely all these technologies at the same time. Having said that, I just wanted to refer to something else. But a very interesting point that you mentioned is the statistics versus the machine learning. Machine learning essentially is just uncertainty, right? It's all to deal with this uncertainty. And I think there are only few people who are comfortable with this uncertainty. And that's probably why there are many people who tend to pretend, no offense, that they are data scientists, but when you dig deep a little bit into what they've done, you appreciate that they are not that scientist, but more statistician. And that's because they are afraid of uncertainty.
Well, actually, this leads on to a very interesting follow-up question, Maxime, is, when you look at an AI project, I mean, the big question, I guess, that needs to always be asked by an organization is, do I develop in-house or do I go outside the organization to implement a solution? I mean, from what you just said as well, there's an element of trust, particularly, when looking at third parties, but also internally, how, as this is a relatively new arena for a lot of organizations, do firms have the capability to be able to hire in and assess and bring in the right skill set? So what are some of the pros and cons you see around in-house versus outsourcing in projects?
Okay, so that's a tricky question. The pros and cons is tricky. And if you don't mind, I'll turn the question on its head. First of all, if you look from the platform/tools perspective, I think today there are enough organizations on the market that offer these platforms, these tools, and they are their core competency. So if, for instance, you take the example of a bank, I think we'll all agree that the core competency of a bank is not to implement an AI-driven platform. Having said that, I think every single organization should have in-house capabilities to maintain these tools, to maintain this platform, and potentially to extend these platforms if it can be done. On the other hand, you have the modeling, and that includes also the data engineering, etc. And again, I believe that any organization should have in-house capability, even to implement the model, but primarily to understand these models. And for a simple reason, it's because at the end of the day, the organization is responsible for these models. And again, if we have time to talk about ethical points, we will address that. Having said that, and I touched base earlier, so I said the tech landscape is very vast. So I strongly believe that outsourcing will help there to at least point to the right direction based on their requirements. And on the other hand, the other thing that you have to appreciate, and I've seen that in previous experience, particularly in banking industry, is the implementation pace is unfortunately slower than the technology pace. So what happens quite often is by the time you deploy in production your model, there's a high likelihood that a new version of the algorithm is already available. And again, this is where outsourcing can help you by either upgrading or maybe to direct you towards, let's say, a more stable algorithm.
Yeah. Ralph, maybe if I could turn to you a little bit on this question as well, because I would assume that you're brought in to manage the project and to take control of it when working with clients. What to you are sort of maybe 2 or 3 of the absolute must-haves? You tell the organization, we must do this to ensure this project goes right, as part of that business collaboration.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, just also linking to what Maxime just said, I think it's important. If you're building an AI solution, or it's a little bit like building your first own house. You don't really, you don't turn into a plumber, you don't turn into an electrician, but rest assured, after 6 months, you have at least come to a level where you understand, or you should be at a level where you understand what these different teams are doing. So that's one thing. The second thing is on the skills. If you outsource or if you have a hired group of people, skilled people doing the stuff because you don't have the capabilities in-house, you need to make sure that they're also working together and that they understand the business. And by definition, somebody who's a data scientist, who's let's say trained to be a mathematician, does not necessarily understand all the insights of the financial business, or all the insights of how does an industrial company operate, and what does this machine do here and there in the process. So you really need to make sure, if you hire the team, that you have a team that understands the business side, because AI projects are never IT projects, they're always business projects. So that's one thing, and that's something you need to make sure if you hire a gang, so to say. The second thing is you need to have buy-in from your management. So a half-hearted, oh yeah, well, I have some budget left, let's give it a try just to see it failing, saying, see, I knew it wouldn't fly, it doesn't really help either. And you need to loop in the business in incremental ways. Start small, be agile. It's like you're driving with a caravan through the center of Luxembourg. You have no real clue where you're going. The only thing you need to make sure is you can go up front and that you don't have to back up.
Yeah. Okay. Ron, I mean, talking about, say, the collaborative effort and working with different organizations, from your perspective, what advice would you give to organizations looking at AI technologies, solutions, when considering a business partner? What are some of the key things they should be asking themselves about looking for the right business partner?
I think the key here is tech intensity. That's a word that we've been using for the past 2 years, in saying, well, every company cannot just rely on a business partner. They need to build skills themselves. They need to make sure that they are resilient to disruption in the market. They need to make sure their people are skilled. And I think Microsoft has a lot of programs in helping organizations do this, and getting people certified, getting people skilled. So I think that's one part of the equation, and making sure that you as a company build in-house skills and in-house tech intensity. And secondly, you often need a business partner to really drive such a project to a good end. And then you're typically looking at, I would say, the same things as always. Where have they done it before? Which people do they bring into the mix? Do they have the right skills? And do they have any kind of assets or accelerators that will make this project happen faster or better, or with more a chance of success? And our customers, they work with very large companies that have fully embraced AI. They also work with some small niche companies that only do AI, only do a part of AI, like computer vision or speech recognition, etc. Both approaches can work, as long as these three elements are being covered and being checked.
Okay, fantastic. So look, listen, we're coming towards the end of our discussion. So let's now hit the big question. Maxime's alluded to it a few times: ethics and AI. I mean, there are a lot of questions being asked by businesses, by individuals, by the media, by regulators around the ethical side of AI, biases, etc., etc. Maxime, what do we do around this? How do you approach this in terms of technology solutions and implementations?
So it's a vast subject. It includes multiple concepts, not only ethics or ethical approach. There's a lot of work that has been done on fairness and diversity, and particularly on the data side. So there are principles. There are several organizations that have grouped together to come with a kind of principle that you should adhere to, or any organization should adhere to, because they're good principle, to be honest. And there are, I would say, some kind of tool. So if I had to rephrase that, I would say, if you use the right tool, the right infrastructure, and the right people, the combination of these three fulfill all the ethics requirements.
And Ralph, your perspective?
Well, for me, AI is just a tool, and as with every tool, it can be used to do good things or bad things. So Do you want to have a policeman to carry a gun? Yes. Do you want to have that evil guy robbing a bank to have the right to own a gun and operate it? Not 100% sure. So I think it will be regulated, and we see that happening on EU level anyway. Yeah. So right now the big discussion is, should facial recognition be completely banned? Yes or no? And so I think, yeah, AI for me is just a tool which can greatly help people to do stuff. It will definitely take some jobs. So, for example, skin cancer is by now, you can use an AI algorithm to spot things much better than a skilled person, or at least on the same level. That will cost some jobs. On the other side, it will create different jobs. We've seen the same thing happening with the car, and if you just take a look around the office, just because the PC and the printer was invented and used instead of a typewriter, does not mean that the tasks will go away. They will change. So people will use that in their daily lives at a different level.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier a little bit about bias, right? That personally I find is an interesting discussion that's come up quite a few times in the media on a world scale. I remember a story about identifying different or providing different credit facilities between men and women, for example, for certain products, etc. But I mean, as I think you alluded to earlier, AI in many ways is about using the data to find those biases, to pinpoint in more detail and differentiate, to be able to do things and make decisions a bit better, right?
Well, we are using, we need to train networks, and we train them based on the knowledge that we have. So, for example, there's a company that used AI to select people who wanted to get a new job. So, and guess what? For engineering jobs, the algorithm learned that there are a lot of more male qualified people than female. Why? Because there were simply much more male engineers around than female engineers.
Yeah.
So the bias in there in the selection criteria was basically, it said, oh yeah, there's a lot of more Rons, Maximes, Raus, and Nazirs around than Alizés or Anclairs. So it learned the bias from the statistics that we as human beings have employed in the past. The hard thing is that right or wrong? Probably it's not right, but we are operating on the same level. So it's just learning from us as human beings.
Yeah. Ron, last word from you on this. How are you dealing with or approaching the ethical side of AI?
Yeah, I think you need to tackle it at two levels. There is a legal or regulatory level, and there is a technical level. And I think on the, let's say on the regulation side, we need to ensure that AI is used in the best interest for mankind. And just yesterday, I heard the EU presenting some proposals on how to avoid misuse of AI. And already in 2017, our chief legal officer has said we need some kind of Geneva Convention, a digital Geneva Convention to limit the use, or at least regulate the use of AI and these kind of technologies.
Ron, if I just quickly on that point, do you think regulators or monitoring bodies have the know-how to create effective regulation on this?
I think that's a work in progress, and that's also the reason why regulations always come after the facts, and why we see the EU talking about it now and coming with proposals now versus 5 years ago. So they will build up those skills, and they will get different lobbyists from companies advising on proper use and maybe some on some other uses of AI, and eventually regulation will help. But they said it's only part of the equation. I think the other part of the equation is on the technical side. And something that is very interesting, what I see happening is what we call XAI or explainable AI, where you move a little bit away from the black box. And you can, as a human, you can kind of understand why a decision was made. Why did we prefer men over women in the example that Ralph mentioned, right? And that can also help on that aspect. It's a combination of both.
Yeah. Listen, that brings us to the end, almost exactly and perfectly timed, as I would well imagine from a bunch of people involved in the technology world. That's fantastic. I appreciate that. Maxime, Ralph, Ron, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your great insights. I will hand back to Elise.